All right. Welcome back, LCC family. It's another week of More Than Sunday. This is our second episode, and thank you so much for taking some time to listen. So we're talking this week. Randy's sermon was about stewardship, and it's centered around Matthew 25, verse 14, and it's the parable of the three servants. And so essentially, it's a story of a master going off on a trip and leaving three of his servants in charge of, one had 1 talent, one had 2 talents, and one had 5 talents. And he said, I'm going to go away on this trip. When I come back, you're going to give an account of what I've left you with. So that's the scripture. That's essentially the story that this is all centered around. And so Randy was talking about, how do we be good stewards of the talents, the resources, the gifts that God's given us?
Yeah. And so I thought this was a really challenging message for me just personally. About, I guess, 6 weeks ago, we kind of wrote down some things that we felt like the Lord had been calling us to, and that the Lord had been laying on our heart, but like we kind of, in essence, had been refusing to do. And this right here was one of the things for me, was actually physically posting social media, putting a podcast out there. And so to hear it on Sunday, and the fact that we did it last week and we'd done one, it was kind of like, it was just kind of pricked at my heart of like, the Lord's given me something to do. He's given me a talent or, a calling, and I need to walk in that.
Yeah.
So
one of the things, and I'm just looking back at it because I was just taking notes when Randy was preaching on Sunday. So the whole concept and point of his message was stewarding your purpose.
Yeah.
And so you have a purpose. We've been talking about what is our purpose, finding God's purpose for our lives. And so the truth is that we do have a purpose, and what are we going to do with that purpose?
Right.
And so he was saying that a lot of people get hung up on that parable and think that it's just talking about money. Right. Because a talent was a form, or it was a representation of currency at that time. And so some of the Bible translations say gold, but again, this was a parable, so Jesus is using a story to communicate a concept of the kingdom. And so we've all been given gifts, like you said. That's something that kind of God's put on your heart to do. And, what were some of the reasons that you felt like you couldn't do it? Because I think that will help some people who know they've got something, a gift, that the Lord wants them to exercise or work on and develop. But there's always that internal voice that kind of keeps us from doing that. So. Right.
Well, I think one of the things that I wrote down on Sunday was we often undervalue what we've been given. And that's so true. Like, we kind of look at ourselves and we're like, well, if I was as talented as them, then I would be better for it, and I could go more. If I had the 5 talents, I could do more. And so I feel like that's always been an attack that I've had on my life. Is, I always feel like the area that you're called to is the area that you're going to be probably attacked in.
Yeah.
And so for me, it is speaking, but then that's also the area that I've always been attacked in over and over and over. I just see that in my life. And so one of the things that was like, we assume our failures make our talents null and void.
Yeah.
But God takes those failures into account when he gave you your talents and your calling and your gifts.
Yeah.
And so that's hard because I look at my past and I go, I can't do this. God doesn't want to use me because what I've done, where I've been. And so we were kind of reading in Peter this week, reading about Peter this week, about how, he denies the Lord 3 times. And so then after Jesus comes back from the dead and they're talking and he says, do you love me? Yeah. And he asks him 3 times, and it's the representation of the 3 times that he denied him. And so I was just thinking about that, and it's just like, I felt like the Lord did that with me this week, and he was like, do you love me? And it was like, yes, Lord, I do. And it was 3 times, because there's been seasons where I felt like I walked away from my faith. And so I felt like that made my calling null and void of like, yeah, you called me before I messed up, and now I've messed up. And so now you haven't called me anymore because I've messed up. And so maybe you've recently messed up, maybe you've recently walked away, and you feel like the calling you've gotten 20 years ago or the purpose you felt like you had a long time ago, it's now null and void. But you're still called.
Yeah.
And God knew you were going to do that.
Yeah.
He took that into account when he called you. And so that's just kind of something I've been working through. It's like Jesus knew that Peter was going to do that. I mean, he literally told him, you're going to deny me.
Yeah.
And so he didn't say, well, you're not the rock anymore.
Right.
You're not called. And so he still is called. He still wants to use him. And from there, that's honestly after that is when Peter's ministry takes off.
Yeah.
We see in Acts, that's when he starts going out and doing what he's called to do. And it was all part of his purpose and God's plan for his life. So,
yeah, I think that not only God sees our purpose, and when he created us, Ephesians says that before the world began, God had chosen us, called us for his purposes.
Right.
It says that we're God's workmanship, created in advance to do the good works that he's prepared for us to do. And I think also the enemy knows that we're created for a purpose.
Right.
And I heard this from one pastor, and I wish I could remember off the top of my head who it was so I can give him credit, but he said that the enemy can't touch your calling or your purpose, but he can distract you and convince you that you can't do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's not from God. That's always from the enemy. And so, like, that's kind of what, you're describing is
right.
like you get attacked in these areas. You feel like you're not good enough. The enemy tries to use shame to keep you from, the enemy could have used shame and probably did use shame for a bit to hinder Peter from speaking out
right.
and stepping into his calling. And so we always kind of need to be aware of that. I was thinking about like comparison, and sometimes we look at other people and it's like, well, if I had what they had, then I could do more.
Right.
But I was kind of thinking, is like, often I think comparison is really just like it's kind of our excuse for not doing anything with what we have.
Right.
We look at somebody and it's like, well, I didn't do anything, but if I had what they had, I could do something. And so I think a lot of times we, like you said, we undervalue what we've been given. And so like comparison can be a negative thing. And then comparison can almost be on the other side of it. It's still negative, but another way to look at it is like, well, at least I'm doing this. They're not doing anything. We compare ourselves that way.
Right.
And, both are wrong. But yeah, we're responsible for what God's given us,
right.
to steward what God's given us. And Randy said, this is a quote from his sermon, and I'm encouraging you guys, go back and listen to it. If you haven't listened to it, listen to it again. I mean, I heard it. I've listened to it twice this week.
Yeah.
But it says God gives you the talents, gifts, and abilities with the right measure of power to use those things. So, I think even with me, I mean, I have some natural leadership abilities that I know I was born with, some communication abilities, and I knew I was called to communicate, but a lot of times I kind of like shrink back because I'm like, ooh, I can't do that. Like, right. I can't do that at that level, or I can't, like, I'm never going to be good at this. But what Randy was saying, and what's true, is that if God gifted you with that talent, he's also given you the power. He's not going to give you something you don't have the power to do.
Right.
So,
but stepping out is scary.
Yeah, it is.
This is scary. Doing this for me has been very scary. This was my idea to do this podcast. But then I was like, well, I don't want to do it. I want Tim and the guys to do it. And, and Tim's made me do it. But,
yep.
I think for a long time we kind of ran from our calling.
Yeah.
We ran from our talents, and we would have been the one that hit it in the ground for a long time. And you look at Peter, and it's like you see that he messed up, but that the Lord still used him greatly after that. And he could have been like, I'm not worthy, but the Lord still pursues him and is like, do you love me? And it's like, then build my church.
Yeah.
So it's just a beautiful story of redemption and the way God pursues all of us. continually, even after we mess up, even after we're not good enough to do what we feel like he's called us to do. He definitely took that into account for sure.
Yeah. And so it's just so cool that, I think sometimes too, if you feel like you have a gift or a talent or a purpose, you can be kind of discouraged, feeling like it's almost like too much pressure because you feel like you're not good at it. And it's like, I'm going to do it once I'm good at it, but I don't know how I'm going to get good at it, and so you're kind of like in this space where you're just like, you're supposed to do something, but you're not going to do it until you feel like it's presentable. Yeah. And I would actually challenge that. And what I've found in my own life is that like, just like with anything, it has to be developed. So God doesn't just like, hey, I'm calling you to do this. I know you're not capable of doing it, but I'm calling you to do that. That's not pressure that he wants on us. A lot of times he tells us, do this, and he opens one door and waits for us to go through it. And it's something that God is like, hey, I want to develop this in you. And I think that that's sometimes what we don't see. We want to be there, but we're not willing to do the steps to get there. Yeah. So, and that's a lot of bumps and bruises and failings and it's a lot of learning. But I think that's the power that Randy's talking about, that he gives us to do those things, right? It's like this path. He's not only provided the talent, but he's provided the pathway to make that talent develop. Right. And sometimes we get too overwhelmed with like what's out there, and it's like, I'll never be that. And
so we bury it like that. So one you just bury it. One. And I totally get that, and I know we've been in those places, and so where there's so much of that story, because it is a story, it's a parable, that we don't know about the ones that got more, that they could have lost a bunch at one point, they could have had more at one point. Yeah,
we don't know how long the time span
was. There's so much more about that story that we don't know, but that we know he saw that they had put the work in. Yeah. That when he left, that they did something with it. Right. Yeah. They didn't have to be, because maybe in reality they could have made 40 million times more. Yeah. But that they did with what they had, and that they weren't called wicked servants. Yeah. But the one that hid it away was. And just on Sunday I know that it was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that. Right. Because I don't want that for my kids either. I don't want them to, to have something that they're called to do and then just be like, I'm too scared to do it. We see that. We're like, no, you can do it. Yeah. And it's like, that's how the Lord feels about me. He's like, you can do it. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And so stewarding our purpose and our gifts, like we've all been given life, we've all been given, God has uniquely designed each and every one of us. And it's for him. Ultimately, we're made to know him and to worship him. And so when we're Christians, and even with our salvation, if we take that and just okay, I'm good with God, and you bury that, right? Everything that we've been given has been given to us to help other people and to help other people know him. Right. And so when we bury any part of that,
any part of our story.
Yeah, any part of our story, we're denying
the work that the Lord's done.
Yeah, we're denying his power. And so Randy went on to talk about James, where he says faith without works is dead. And it's not that our works, save us and make God happy with us, but our works, really, our works and what we do tells the world what's inside of us.
Right, yeah.
And so when we don't step out, when we're not courageous, it shows that we might think that God is, gonna just, beat us over the head if we screw up or fail. And I think that's the mistake that the wicked servant made.
Oh, yeah.
And his assumption, and I'm going to read it real quick. So this is the servant that had one talent. So this is Matthew 25:24. It says, "And the one also who had received the one talent came up and said, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away, and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours.' But his master answered, and said to him, "You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, or gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have at least received my money back with interest."
Right.
And so, I think we do that a lot, and we worry about like, well, if I fail, then that's it. And that's the wrong assumption about God. And so the reason he calls that servant wicked is like, basically he's saying, you made the complete wrong assumption about me. I'm not a hard man. I'm a generous man. I gave you that.
Yeah, right.
And so like, I'm a generous master. I'm a generous person. And so where I go, I bring life and I bring multiplication. And, so it was kind of an excuse. And so sometimes it's because we don't have the right understanding of who God is and how much he believes in us.
Right.
And acting on that instead of acting on our fears. So,
right. Yeah, this is a Craig Rochelle quote about Peter. And it said, "Can you imagine anyone preaching with more passion than the guy who was forgiven after denying Jesus 3 different times?"
Yeah.
And so let your failures, let your past become part of your story. That does reach others. Tim's story and our marriage, I think, we have people come to us all the time that said it's helped them, because we're open and honest about where we've been. And so that's part of your story, and let that be your testimony and not the thing that holds you down and that makes you want to hide your talent.
Yeah.
Because you're not worthy is what we think in our human eyes.
Yeah.
So.
That's good.
All right.
Well, so just remember, what we do and how we steward our purpose, it shows what's inside of us.
Right.
And so, maybe some of the things you're doing, maybe you're looking into your life and you're not really happy with what you're doing or what your life looks like. Maybe that's a red flag to start looking inside and maybe addressing some of the ways that, like, okay, how do I feel about my purpose? How do I feel about the way God feels about me?
Right.
And the Lord wants us to really know him. And so I would just challenge you, if you feel like, if you're in this place where you're scared of failing,
Right.
I just want to encourage you that the Lord loves you. He believes in you.
Yeah.
He believes more in you than you've ever believed in yourself.
Right.
Think of your biggest fan that you've ever had, whether that's a parent or a spouse, and multiply that by infinity. And he believes in you. He put things in you that he wants to change the world with.
Yeah.
And so I would just, encourage you to ask God, like, Lord, change my mind about you.
Yeah.
Show me who you are, because I want to be all that you've made me to be.
Yeah.
And so I've got my last thing is I've got a great book that deals with all of this and your purpose and stewarding your purpose. And it's by John Bevere. It's called Multiply Your God-Given Potential. And in the description, I'll put a link to Amazon on it. It's an incredible book. It will challenge you. It will describe what stewardship is and what God's plan is for the things that he's given all of us.
Yeah.
So
Love it.
that's all I got. Thank you guys for taking your time to listen to us. We'll see you Sunday, and we love you.